Let's get more on those Brexit talks now. If you were unkind, you might look at the impeccably tailored French president and compare him to Boris Johnson, whose appearance is, well, a little less sharp. But it's clear that the Prime Minister has a charisma of his own and a message as crisp as Emmanuel Macron's collar. We can't do a deal unless you drop the backstop. So where does that leave Britain, Ireland and the EU? Let's get a French perspective on those talks from Nabila Ramdani, who joins me in the studio now. Nabila, how did Boris Johnson stand up against Emmanuel Macron?
Well, I'm afraid to say that the kind of meeting that we actually saw today was entirely predictable. We saw Emmanuel Macron being as superficially polite as he always is, but there was never any prospect of him backing down, really. French heads of state are expected to be diplomatic and well-mannered at all times, and this is exactly what we saw during the 10-minute press conference that Mr. Macron gave on the steps of the Élysée Palace before lunch. And he also acknowledged that we are a few weeks away before a potential no deal, but he insisted that the Irish backstop was indispensable, and that's where the crux of the matter is really the EU has rebuffed Mr. Johnson's attempts at tearing apart the Irish backstop, and there was a coordinated response from the EU which appeared to have closed the door to further meaningful Brexit negotiations. It also has to be noted that Mr. Macron mentioned Michel Barnier, who is of course the EU chief negotiator, meaning that, making it clear, in fact, that it's the EU hierarchy and not the presidents of France who are really calling the shots.
Boris Johnson was photographed leaving the Élysée Palace with his arms up in the air in what's being read as a triumphant gesture. Could he take some credit from this? Because Emmanuel Macron did seem to shift, didn't he? When he talked about any new withdrawal agreement that you might get within 30 days won't be that different to the deal you've already got. Well, that's a different position to the one we've heard from before, which was the withdrawal agreement is closed.
Well, I think, Boris Johnson is an extremely pragmatic politician, and he would see Mr. Macron as a very wily technocrat who is, of course, very close to Michel Barnier, another Frenchman. And Mr. Johnson will be to try to use Mr. Macron to revive, EU talks, really. I think it's very unfair to say that despite Mr. Macron's very firm position that, UK demands to renegotiate Britain's exit from, the EU were simply not an option. I don't think that should be read as him being anti-British.
Well, he's made no secret of his feelings about Britain's decision.
Yes, I mean, he's called Brexit a crime from day one, and he's always expressed utter frustration at the entire process. But he's also, very much of an Anglophile. He speaks English perfectly. He's told me about his holidays and, weekends away in the UK. He, believe it or not, he even had a great-grandfather who fought for the British during the First World War. So he's very pragmatic in many ways. And let's not forget that, to him, the EU project, France being one of the founding fathers of the EU, the entire project, he's always been adamant about the EU not just being a trading bloc, but also a vital conduit for peace and security. And that's why, there is no way he can tolerate, if you like, the idea of a border being reinstated on the island of Ireland. That's where the problem lies, really.
We are following every twist and turn as we head towards that October the 31st deadline, a new deadline of 30 days set in the discussions with Angela Merkel yesterday. Following it here, but I wonder in France how it is being perceived.
Well, we talk about Brexit constantly here. It's, of course, very high in the news agenda at all times, but I can assure you that it's not the case in France. If anything, I think the general feeling in France is that, the French feel sorry, really, that Britain had chosen to break away from the EU, and they certainly see Boris Johnson as a lively character, in spite of the insults he has levelled at the French over the recent years. But which I won't repeat here, but it's not the kind of language that Mr. Macron would approve of. But I think Boris Johnson's government is very much seen as short-term and one government that will preside over one of the most turbulent periods in recent history. And whatever Mr. Johnson does will result in extreme chaos. That's the general perception in France.
Nabila Ramdani, thank you very much indeed for talking to us this evening.